one thing for anybody who has gone through divorce or anybody who has left somebody and you look back, when somebody shows you who they are, believe them.
Yeah.
It's so much easier to make excuses for the bad circumstance that you're in or the bad situation. Oh, it's just right now, or he's going through something, or it's just a phase we're going through. But at the end of the day, your intuition, your gut, and who you really want to be will always be there to nudge you and move you. And until you move it.
Some endings don't arrive with explosions. They slip in quietly, while everyone's still applauding the beginning. For a long time, Jeannie and Jeezy were treated like proof that love could survive damage. Two people with pasts heavy enough to harden anyone, somehow finding calm in each other. No chaos, no public mess, just maturity, faith, and the promise of something steady.
Things that I've been criticized for my whole life in my past relationships, Jeannie, you're too deep. You think about things too much. Like, why does everything gotta have a purpose? And I'm not one for small talk or small conversations. I wanna know, why do you think the way you do? What brought you to look at things the way you do? Who are you? Who's important to you? And I found my equal.
That was the version people held on to. That was the image that stuck. But images don't tell you what happens behind closed doors. They don't show you the silences. They don't show you the moments when one person is still fighting while the other has already decided to leave. And now, after carrying that weight in private for far too long, Jeannie isn't absorbing it anymore.
You know, I'm not gonna lie, it takes every day to just really sit and just be quiet in your thoughts, take care of me. But one thing I know is, you give God your pain, he will give you his power. Period.
Not to be loud, not to tear anyone down, but because there's a point where staying quiet stops being grace and starts becoming self-erasure. The real sting in this story isn't the breakup itself, it's what came after. Because while she was rebuilding herself out of sight, Jeezy was stepping in front of microphones, talking about growth, about purpose, about finally learning who he is. Calm voice, gentle cadence. A man presented as evolved, while the woman who stood beside him during that evolution was being slowly written out of the narrative. And the irony cuts deep. The same man who once admitted he'd never truly known love built his new identity on the woman who showed him what it looked like.
That's the crazy thing, though, because as I say here at 46, I can tell you that.
Yeah.
But I can't honestly tell you that I've experienced love.
It was just always instances where I just knew that this wasn't gonna work out for me, right? So I had to figure out how to change without losing everything.
This didn't begin with divorce papers. It began years earlier, at a moment when Jeannie wasn't even looking for love. She'd already been through a marriage that changed her, drained her, left her rebuilding herself piece by piece. She never hid that truth. She said it plainly. She didn't want marriage again, didn't want kids, didn't want to hand anyone the kind of power that could undo her life if it went wrong. That wasn't fear. That was self-preservation. So when Jeezy entered her life, it didn't feel risky. It felt safe. He moved differently than the men she'd known. Slower, quieter, like someone who'd already survived his storms and come out reflective instead of reckless. He spoke about faith, healing, intention, about learning from mistakes instead of running from them.
More than ever,
Yeah.
I understand my purpose is walking in these footprints that God's left for me.
And what is your purpose
My
now?
purpose is to be the best version of myself and to teach my culture everything that I learned along the way.
And for a woman who had spent years protecting her heart, that language sounded like peace. They didn't start as a whirlwind. They started as conversation, familiarity, late-night talks that felt grounding instead of draining. When she later described their first real date, sushi, hours of talking, dancing before the night ended, she didn't call it flashy. She called it magic. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was easy. For the first time in a long time, she could imagine a future without bracing herself for impact. That's the part people tend to miss. She didn't fall for hype, she fell for consistency. When they finally went public, fans latched on instantly. This wasn't just a celebrity couple. This was grown love, healed love. The kind of relationship people pointed to as proof that doing the work actually pays off. Jeannie looked lighter, spoke softer, like someone who no longer felt like she had to guard every part of herself. And Jeezy played his role seamlessly. Every appearance felt curated but convincing. Every interview sounded thoughtful. He talked about becoming a better man, about how love had changed him, about partnership and accountability. He wasn't just selling albums anymore. He was selling evolution. And then Jeannie said something that locked their image in place forever. She said he made her realize she'd never truly felt safe before. That one sentence did more for his transformation than anything else ever could. Suddenly, he wasn't just a rapper with a refined image. He was a man who provided emotional safety, stability, growth, the kind of partner people used as a reference point. But what no one saw were the fractures already forming beneath that calm. Because while Jeannie was experiencing love as refuge, Jeezy was experiencing it as reinforcement. His past carried weight, complicated, layered, hard to shake. Standing next to Jeannie softened everything, made him more credible, more trustworthy, more palatable in spaces that once questioned him. She didn't just love him, she legitimized him. And she gave him the very things she once promised herself she never would again. She changed her mind about marriage, about motherhood. After years of saying children weren't part of her path, she leaned all the way in. IVF, hormones, emotional highs and crashes. She didn't do it out of obligation. She did it because she believed in what they were building. When their daughter arrived, the world celebrated. The story looked complete. Photos full of warmth, captions about faith and gratitude, interviews about family and purpose. They were held up as proof that love after heartbreak could be even stronger. But real life doesn't always honor the story people fall in love with. Quietly, something shifted. The presence faded. The conversations thinned. The warmth cooled. The same man who once felt emotionally available began to feel unreachable. Not angry, not explosive, just gone. And absence, when it comes from someone who once made you feel safe, cuts deeper than conflict ever could. Jeannie felt it. She noticed the distance, the way she was carrying the emotional weight alone. But she didn't panic. She didn't jump to conclusions. She did what people do when they believe in the foundation. She tried to fix it. Therapy, conversations, effort, adjustments. What she didn't know was that while she was trying to heal the marriage, he was preparing to leave it. That truth wouldn't surface immediately, but the first public crack came during an interview that would change everything. Jeezy sat calmly, speaking with clarity and control. He talked about reflection, about age, about self-awareness. And then he said something that landed like a punch to the chest. He said he couldn't honestly say he'd ever experienced love. The statement didn't just confuse people, it stunned them. This was the man who publicly praised Jeannie as his soulmate, who spoke about walking through life with her, who let the world believe she was the embodiment of his growth. And with one sentence, he erased her. While the internet dissected his words, Jeannie was absorbing the impact in private. Not just the statement itself, but the tone, the lack of acknowledgement, the way he positioned himself as reflective and wounded, while leaving her holding the emotional fallout. He spoke about therapy, about peace, about only being responsible for his own journey. What he never spoke about was accountability. And that's when the realization hit her. He wasn't just leaving the marriage. He was controlling the narrative, casting himself as evolved while quietly assigning her the role of obstacle. To the public, his calm sounded like wisdom. To Jeannie, it felt like manipulation wrapped in spirituality. Because while he was talking about self-love, she was processing the shock of being blindsided. The same man who once promised partnership filed for divorce without warning. No conversation, no preparation, just paperwork. Delivered while she was still fighting for something she believed mattered. And even after that, the performance didn't stop. Statements about respect, about heavy hearts, about mutual care. Meanwhile, she was protecting their child from headlines and herself from a truth she wasn't ready to face yet. When Jeannie finally spoke, it wasn't loud, it wasn't messy, it was controlled. One sentence that carried everything she didn't say. You give God your pain, and he gives you his power. That wasn't weakness. That was a woman choosing dignity when she had every reason to unravel. And slowly, people began to feel it. Something wasn't lining up. The more he spoke, the emptier it sounded. The quieter she stayed, the heavier her silence became. Because silence, when it's intentional, isn't surrender. It's restraint. And restraint doesn't last forever. The truth was already pressing at the edges. And it was only beginning to surface. And that pressure didn't come from nowhere. It came from watching someone you loved turn your shared life into a solo redemption tour. After that interview, things felt different. Not just for Jeannie, but for the people who'd believed in them. His words lingered in the air, heavy and unresolved. Saying he'd never experienced love wasn't just a reflection, it was a rewrite. And rewrites always leave someone erased. For Jeannie, it landed quietly at first. No outbursts, no public corrections. Just a slow, sinking realization that the man she married was no longer protecting the truth they lived. He was protecting the image he wanted to carry forward. While the world debated his intentions, she was replaying moments in her head. Conversations that suddenly made sense. Emotional withdrawals she'd blamed on stress. The way his presence had faded long before his name ever showed up in a filing. She remembered how often he'd said he needed peace, how those words became a wall instead of an invitation. Anytime she asked for clarity, it turned into a lesson about patience. Anytime she expressed hurt, it got reframed as her needing to do her own work. That's how it started to feel less like healing and more like deflection. Behind closed doors, she wasn't dramatic. She wasn't volatile. She was steady, asking questions, requesting honesty, trying to understand where the disconnect had come from. But the answers stayed vague, circular, always calm, always just enough to sound evolved without ever addressing the damage. And calm, when it's used that way, can be cruel. Because when someone speaks softly while dodging responsibility, it leaves you questioning your own reality. It makes you wonder if asking for effort is somehow asking for too much. If wanting to be chosen is a flaw instead of a foundation. Jeannie started carrying that confusion quietly. She didn't run to social media. She didn't involve outsiders. She believed in protecting the family, especially with a child involved. Whatever cracks existed, she was determined to fix them privately. What she didn't realize was that privacy had already been weaponized against her. While she was still planning family routines and showing up for his milestones, he was stepping further into independence. His schedule shifted. His energy changed. The emotional availability she once relied on felt rationed. And then came the paperwork. No warning, no sit-down conversation that acknowledged the gravity of what was happening. Just a sudden reality drop, delivered through channels that felt cold and impersonal. The man who once spoke endlessly about partnership chose distance when it mattered most. That moment did something to her. Not loudly, not immediately, but it cracked something deep. Because heartbreak is one thing, being blindsided is another. But realizing someone has been preparing their exit while letting you stay invested, that changes how you process everything. She went back over the timeline. The trips, the smiles, the public support she continued to give him even as things felt off. Promoting his work, speaking proudly about his growth, standing next to him while he was already mentally elsewhere. That's when the betrayal sharpened. Not because he left, but because he let her love him out loud while he was quietly closing the door. And even after the filing, the narrative kept moving without her. Statements were released, carefully worded, heavy-hearted, respectful, the kind of language that sounds noble while saying very little. He positioned the split as mutual growth, two people walking separate paths with grace. But Jeannie knew what wasn't being said. There was no acknowledgement of how sudden it was, no recognition of how unbalanced the ending had been, no accountability for the emotional fallout she was left managing alone, while still showing up as a mother, a professional, and a public figure expected to keep her composure. She chose silence anyway, not because she didn't have anything to say, but because she had too much. She focused inward, therapy, prayer, relearning herself without the relationship framing her identity. She protected her daughter from the noise, even as headlines tried to pull the family apart piece by piece. And every time he appeared in another interview, speaking about clarity and purpose, it stung, not because she wanted him quiet, but because the truth was still being bent. Each quote felt like a subtle revision. Each calm reflection chipped away at a version of events that didn't include her experience. He spoke like someone who'd simply outgrown a chapter. She felt like someone who'd been dropped mid-sentence. People started noticing. Fans rewatched interviews with different eyes. The pauses, the way questions about accountability got rerouted into philosophy, how often growth was mentioned without ever naming what went wrong. And slowly, the image began to shift. Because growth without ownership starts to sound hollow. Peace without honesty starts to look performative. And the more he leaned into that persona, the clearer it became that this wasn't just about personal healing. It was about control. Control of the story. Control of perception. Control of legacy. Jeannie began to understand something important. She wasn't just healing from a marriage. She was disentangling herself from someone else's brand. Her grace had become part of his credibility. Her stability softened his past. Her presence gave weight to his transformation. And when she was no longer convenient to that image, she was quietly moved aside. That realization hurt, but it also clarified everything. She stopped internalizing his words, stopped questioning whether she'd asked for too much, stopped shrinking herself to fit a narrative that never fully included her. Instead, she started reclaiming her own truth, slowly, deliberately. Not through exposés, not through accusations, through reflection. She posted less, but when she did, the words carried weight. Messages about strength, about boundaries, about choosing yourself when love stops choosing you. Nothing overt, nothing messy, but enough for people paying attention to feel the shift. Behind the scenes, she was writing, processing, putting language to things she'd swallowed for years, not for retaliation, but for release. Because there's a difference between silence as protection and silence as self-betrayal. And she was done with the second one. As months passed, the contrast became impossible to ignore. He continued speaking about evolution, about becoming a better version of himself. But the more he talked, the more people noticed what was missing. There was no space made for her humanity, no acknowledgement of her effort, no recognition of the partnership he once praised. Just a forward-facing narrative where he stood alone, enlightened, unburdened, untouched by the wreckage behind him. Jeannie didn't rush to correct it. She waited. Because sometimes the most powerful response isn't interruption, it's timing. And as the dust settled, one thing became clear. The story people thought they knew was incomplete. And the woman who'd been quiet long enough was finally ready to let the truth breathe. Not all at once, but piece by piece. That readiness didn't come from anger. It came from clarity. By the time Jeannie finally let herself speak, even softly, she wasn't trying to correct anyone anymore. She wasn't fighting for public sympathy. She was reclaiming something quieter and far more important. Her own voice. What people mistook for silence had always been strategy. She stayed quiet for her daughter. For peace. For dignity. For the simple belief that not every truth needs a microphone to be real. But there's a cost to letting someone else keep narrating your life. Especially when their version slowly erases your role in it. And every time he spoke about growth without accountability, it sharpened the contrast. Because growth that leaves damage unnamed isn't growth, it's branding. Jeannie saw it clearly now. The interviews, the quotes, the calm delivery that made him sound centered while never acknowledging the emotional wreckage behind him. It wasn't accidental, it was curated. And once she stopped internalizing it, the fog lifted. She didn't lose herself because the marriage ended. She lost herself when she kept shrinking to preserve someone else's image. That realization changed everything. Her energy shifted. No more explaining, no more subtle defending, just boundaries, the kind that don't announce themselves but are felt immediately. She focused on her work, her faith, her child, on building a life that didn't require approval or applause. And when she finally spoke publicly again, it wasn't an attack. It was a mirror. She talked about confusing comfort for connection, about how peace can sometimes be silence dressed up as safety, about what it feels like to love someone who's more committed to becoming a symbol than being a partner. Those words landed because they weren't bitter. They were honest. People listened differently this time. Not because she was louder, but because she was grounded. There was no chaos in her tone. No need to convince. Just the steadiness of someone who'd already done the hardest part of healing in private. And suddenly, the narrative flipped. Not dramatically, not overnight, but enough that people started seeing the gaps, the missing accountability, the way his evolution never seemed to include the woman who stood beside him through it. Jeannie didn't need to say his name anymore. The truth was doing the work for her. She closed one appearance with a line that summed up everything without dragging anyone through the mud. Love without respect isn't love, it's performance. And that was it. No more carrying what wasn't hers. No more letting her grace be misused as someone else's shield. She didn't walk away broken, she walked away awake. Because when the noise fades and the quotes stop circulating, what's left is reality. One person left with clarity. The other left maintaining a story that can't outrun the truth forever. Jeannie chose herself. And that choice, quiet, firm, and overdue, was the real ending.